When Joni Lamb went head-to-head with Julie Roys, no one was prepared for what unfolded. What began as a clash of words quickly turned into a stunning revelation that ripped the lid off secrets hiding in plain sight. Daystar viewers were left reeling, the faith community buzzing, and even Roys herself blindsided. What exactly did Joni reveal that shook the conversation so fiercely? One thing's clear. This is a showdown nobody saw coming. Julie Roys never set out to tear down Daystar or drag Joni Lamb's name through the mud. At first, her investigation was quiet, almost hesitant. She had worked with the Lambs before and had seen the heart of the ministry up close. Like so many others, she believed in the mission of spreading the gospel through media. But over time, whispers began to reach her ears. Small things at first. Rumors of lavish hotels, business-class flights, and expensive wardrobes. Nothing unusual maybe, not when you're running a network that broadcasts to the world. But something about the stories didn't sit right. Why would a ministry built on donations from everyday people need so much luxury? Julie started digging. She followed paper trails, asked questions, and spoke with people who had once worked inside Daystar's offices. What she found at first was frustrating. Closed doors, silence, and a wall of secrecy. Daystar wasn't required to file the same public tax records as most nonprofits because of its classification as a church, and that meant there were no financial reports available to the public. Donors couldn't see where their money was really going. No one outside the inner circle knew how much was being spent on salaries, travel, or perks. It was all hidden, and the secrecy itself raised red flags. The turning point came when Julie uncovered information about Daystar's private jet. Ministries owning planes isn't unheard of, but this wasn't just a tool for outreach. It was being used for personal trips, soft leather seats, and the comfort of those at the very top. And worse, the money that paid for it didn't come from business profits or side ventures. It came straight from the pockets of viewers, ordinary people who gave because they thought they were funding missions, prayer efforts, and ministry work. Some of those people were elderly, living on fixed incomes. Some gave their last $100 believing it was a sacrifice for the kingdom. For Julie, this discovery hit like a punch to the gut. It wasn't simply about a jet or luxury travel. It was about trust. People gave with pure hearts, believing their gifts were helping to spread the love of Christ. Instead, their money may have been fueling a lifestyle that looked more like celebrity than ministry. And that realization was too heavy to ignore. She knew she couldn't keep what she found to herself, so she pulled back the curtain. She brought the truth out into the open, knowing full well the backlash it might bring. And once she did, everything about Daystar and about Joni Lamb would never look the same again. The stories that broke hearts didn't come in headlines or news reports at first. They came in quiet phone calls, in whispered conversations, in the voices of people who had once believed so deeply in Daystar and then found themselves carrying heavy regret. Julie Roys, in her investigation, wasn't just chasing numbers. She was listening to people, former employees, donors, and even volunteers, who had lived through the ministry's darker side. And the more stories she heard, the harder they became to ignore. One of the most haunting stories came from a woman who had worked the phones during one of Daystar's big telethons. The air was always charged during those events. Hundreds of calls would come in, people pledging what they could, often inspired by fiery messages about God's blessings and promises of multiplied returns. The woman told Julie about one particular call that had stayed with her for years. On the other end of the line was an elderly woman, sobbing quietly. She said she had very little left, only a small amount available on her credit card, but she wanted to give her last $1,000, 0 cents. Why? Because a preacher on the broadcast had promised that if she did, God would return tenfold. The worker processed the donation, but as she did, something inside her broke. She knew this woman wasn't giving out of abundance. She was giving out of desperation, and instead of feeling like ministry, it felt like exploitation. This story wasn't unique. Julie kept hearing different versions of the same heartbreaking theme. People giving beyond their means, often with tears in their eyes, believing they were planting seeds for blessings that might never come. Former employees told her how those telethons shifted over the years. In the beginning, they were focused on prayer and encouragement, but over time the language became sharper, more emotional, more insistent. The message was clear: give more, and God will bless you more. The people answering phones could hear the pain on the other end. They heard stories of families struggling to pay bills, people battling illness, and widows stretching their last dollars. all convinced that their sacrifice would move heaven. It wasn't just about the money, though. It was about the way those giving felt afterward. Some former donors told Julie they felt ashamed, like they had been tricked. They thought they were supporting missions, feeding the poor, or spreading the gospel. Instead, they later learned that part of their money might have gone to luxury hotels, fine meals, or even a private jet. The betrayal stung deeply because their giving had come from a place of faith, love, and trust. To discover it may have been used to fund a lifestyle instead of a mission left scars that couldn't be easily healed. Employees, too, carried heavy stories. Some said they joined Daystar because it felt like a calling. They wanted to serve God, to use their skills for something eternal. In the beginning, the atmosphere was full of prayer and purpose, but as the ministry grew, they began to notice changes. Pressure replaced passion. Control replaced community. And behind the smiles and polished broadcasts, they said they felt fear. Fear of questioning leadership, fear of speaking up, fear of losing everything if they dared to challenge the system. One man recalled how promotions seemed to go not to the most skilled or faithful, but to those most loyal to the Lambs. Loyalty became currency, and integrity often didn't matter. Another worker remembered the cold looks from leadership when anyone even hinted at questioning financial decisions. The unspoken rule was clear: don't ask questions, just obey. Many employees stayed quiet, but deep down, they knew something wasn't right. Julie also heard stories of young staffers who left the ministry broken. Some said they struggled with their faith after leaving Daystar, unable to reconcile how a ministry that spoke so much about Jesus could act so differently behind the scenes. Some stopped going to church altogether, too hurt and too disillusioned to trust spiritual leaders again. Others wrestled with guilt, wondering if they had been part of hurting people by playing a role in the system. But perhaps the hardest stories to hear were from the donors themselves. Julie listened as people described how they gave money they couldn't afford to lose. Some had emptied savings accounts, others maxed out credit cards. They weren't reckless. They were desperate for hope and believed the promises spoken on air. Many said they were told in direct language that if they gave, God would give back more, almost like a guarantee. When the blessings didn't come, they felt not only financially broken but spiritually wounded, as if God himself had failed them. The heartbreak wasn't just about lost money. It was about lost faith. For so many, Daystar wasn't just a TV channel. It was their spiritual companion. It was the voice in their living room, the prayer they joined each morning, the encouragement that kept them going during dark times. To find out that the same ministry they trusted might have been using their money for luxury and hiding financial truth was more than disappointing. Daystar held a phenomenal disappointment. It felt like betrayal from a family member. Julie knew that these stories carried a weight that numbers on a page never could. Numbers could show misuse of funds, but stories showed the human cost. Stories showed the tears, the doubts, the disillusionment. They showed what happens when trust is broken in the name of God. And for many, the damage went beyond finances or disappointment. It touched the deepest part of their faith. The stories that broke hearts weren't about greed or corruption on paper. They were about people. Real people who had given their best, their last, their faith-filled dollars, believing they were helping spread the gospel. Instead, they were left empty, questioning not just Daystar, not just Joni Lamb, but sometimes even questioning God himself. And that, more than anything else, was the tragedy Julie wanted the world to see. When the storm around Daystar began to swell, it didn't take long for Joni Lamb's name to rise to the surface. At first, people thought of the scandal as a problem with the ministry itself, a case of mismanagement or maybe a few poor financial decisions made by a large organization. But the deeper Julie Roys and others looked, the more one fact became impossible to ignore. Joni wasn't just a face on the screen. She wasn't just a host, a smiling presence, or the widow of Marcus Lamb carrying on his vision. She was the one in charge. Her fingerprints were on the decisions that caused the uproar, and suddenly the storm wasn't circling Daystar in general. It was circling her. For years, Joni had built an image of grace and strength. She was elegant but approachable, polished yet relatable. Millions of viewers tuned in to Johnny Table Talk and felt like she was a friend speaking into their lives. She prayed, she wept with guests, she encouraged people through scripture. For many, she wasn't just a broadcaster, she was a spiritual leader they trusted. That trust made what came next all the more painful. When stories of hidden spending, luxury perks, and private jets came out, Joni's supporters were quick to defend her. They said she would never knowingly misuse money. They insisted she was being attacked for doing God's work. But as questions mounted, something began to shift. Julie's reporting showed that the decisions weren't distant ones made by nameless executives. They were decisions tied directly to Joni's leadership. The jet wasn't just a ministry tool, it was a purchase she defended. The financial secrecy wasn't just oversight, it was a pattern that continued under her watch. And instead of confronting the allegations with transparency, she chose a different strategy, framing criticism as persecution. Whenever reporters pressed for answers, Joni said the media was twisting facts to harm the church. She called the accusations spiritual warfare. She reminded viewers that Satan comes to attack leaders when they are doing something great for God. To her loyal base, these words sounded convincing, but to those seeking real answers, they felt like deflection. On social media, the split became clear. Thousands of fans flooded her accounts with Bible verses, encouragement, and promises of prayer. They declared their support, saying they would stand with her against the lies of the enemy. But others began to lose patience. They didn't want emotional speeches, they wanted numbers. They wanted financial reports. They wanted an honest explanation about why donations from struggling families were being used in ways that didn't line up with the mission, and Joni didn't provide them. Every vague comment about God's favor and legacy only deepened the sense that she was avoiding the truth. The most devoted followers struggled with what they were seeing. They had believed in her for years, admired her faith, and even shaped parts of their own spiritual lives around her words. But now they began to rewatch old episodes of her programs with new eyes. The tears, the prayers, the encouragement, were they real, or were they part of a carefully managed image? Some said it felt like discovering a close friend had been lying to them for years. That sense of betrayal cut deeper than any financial scandal ever could. Inside Daystar, employees noticed the storm gathering speed. Some said Joni doubled down, pressing harder, working harder, appearing more often on air, as if proving that she wouldn't be broken. But her silence on the details spoke louder than anything she said in front of the cameras. There were no open books, no apologies, no acknowledgement of the pain people were feeling. Instead, her posture remained defensive, a leader painting herself as a victim rather than taking responsibility. For some insiders, this was the breaking point. They had once admired her strength, but now they saw pride where humility should have been. The narrative shifted quickly. Joni Lamb, once celebrated as a spiritual role model, was now being talked about as a figure who put image before integrity. The woman who had preached about stewardship, honesty, and humility was being accused of covering up extravagance, secrecy, and control. And the harder she tried to hold on to her image, the more it slipped away. Outside of the network, churches began distancing themselves. Pastors who had once partnered with Daystar were suddenly hesitant to promote it. Some quietly pulled programming, not wanting their congregations associated with scandal. Others spoke carefully but clearly, saying accountability was needed. And through it all, Joni remained the center of attention. Her every move scrutinized, her every word weighed. The heartbreaking part is that Joni had built something powerful. She was not just Marcus's wife or a co-founder living in his shadow. She had become the face of the network, a voice millions trusted. But when the moment of crisis came, instead of opening her hands, she closed them tighter. Instead of humbling herself, she dug in. And in doing so, she changed the way people saw her. What once looked like strength now looked like stubbornness. What once looked like faith now looked like fear of losing control. And what once looked like leadership now looked like deflection. The storm didn't just expose financial issues at Daystar. It exposed Joni Lamb. And for many who had trusted her the most, that was the hardest truth to accept. Because in the end, the real story wasn't about a jet or even about money. It was about trust. It was about the image of a woman who had built her life on preaching integrity and then failed to show it when it mattered most. And that's why Joni Lamb found herself, not just Daystar, at the very center of the storm. Trust is fragile, and when it breaks in the world of faith, the damage cuts deeper than most people can imagine. For decades, Daystar wasn't just another television channel. It was a trusted voice in living rooms, hospitals, nursing homes, and churches. People tuned in because they believed. They gave because they wanted to be part of something bigger than themselves. They trusted Marcus and Joni Lamb not only as broadcasters but as spiritual leaders who would steward their money and prayers with integrity. But once the curtain was pulled back, once the stories about private jets, luxury spending, and hidden finances began to spread, that trust shattered. And when it shattered, it wasn't just Daystar's reputation that took a hit. It was people's faith in Christian media as a whole. For longtime viewers, the revelations landed like a betrayal from a close friend. They remembered Joni's warm presence on Table Talk, the prayers she led, the scriptures she quoted. She had been with them in their darkest nights, offering hope through a screen. To hear that the money they gave out of sacrifice might have funded luxury trips or personal perks was more than disappointing. It felt like being lied to by someone you loved. Many described it as heartbreak, not over dollars and cents, but over trust that could never be restored. Churches that once welcomed Daystar content into their services started pulling away. Some pastors spoke carefully, saying they needed to see accountability before continuing partnerships. Others simply stopped airing the programs, not wanting to be associated with the controversy. Congregations asked hard questions. Should we keep supporting a network accused of hiding finances? Can we believe the messages if the messengers aren't transparent? Those questions spread like wildfire in Bible studies, prayer groups, and Sunday school classes. What once united people in faith now divided them in doubt. Donors, too, began to rethink their commitments. Some had given faithfully for decades, writing checks each month because they believed they were helping spread the gospel. Others had given during telethons, responding to promises of multiplied blessings. Many of them were not wealthy. They were elderly, widowed, or struggling to make ends meet. To discover that their sacrifices might have been used for extravagance left them devastated. Some stopped giving altogether, not just to Daystar, but to ministries in general. They didn't want to risk being misled again. For a ministry built on donations, this loss of trust was catastrophic. Inside Daystar, the atmosphere grew tense. Employees who once felt proud to be part of something holy now felt caught in the middle of a scandal. Morale dropped. Whispers filled the halls. Some staff updated their resumes, fearing the network's future was slipping away. Others stayed loyal to Joni, hoping she would find a way to restore order and credibility. But every day without a clear response made the silence feel heavier. Transparency never came. Apologies never came. Instead, vague statements about persecution and spiritual attacks filled the air, leaving many employees feeling even more conflicted. Outside, the public conversation grew harsher. Social media, once filled with encouragement for Joni, shifted to criticism and anger. Hashtags calling for accountability trended. Old clips of her broadcasts were pulled apart, analyzed for hidden meaning, used as evidence of manipulation. Every smile, every prayer, every tear was re-examined. What had once felt genuine now looked suspicious. For someone who had spent her life cultivating an image of integrity, the reversal was brutal. The internet doesn't forget, and in this case, it didn't forgive. The hardest part of the collapse wasn't the headlines, it was the ripple effect. When a ministry fails this publicly, it casts a shadow over every other ministry. Believers began asking themselves, if Daystar can hide secrets, who else is hiding them too? That suspicion spread far beyond one network. Smaller ministries, innocent pastors, and faithful organizations suddenly faced questions they hadn't earned, all because trust in one of the biggest names in Christian media had been broken. In many ways, Joni's scandal became symbolic of a larger problem, the uneasy marriage of money, media, and ministry. For Joni personally, the fallout was relentless. She had spent years presenting herself as a steady, faithful leader, a woman who carried her husband's legacy and built one of the largest Christian networks in the world. Now she was being painted as the architect of secrecy, a figure who chose power and image over openness. And because she refused to answer directly, the narrative hardened against her. Silence, in this case, spoke louder than any sermon. As the weeks turned into months, the sense of uncertainty only grew. Would Daystar survive? Could it rebrand, rebuild, or recover? Or would it slowly fade into irrelevance, remembered only for what it had once been before trust collapsed? The financial strain was already showing. Donations dropped, sponsors hesitated, ministries pulled content. For the first time in its history, the network's future wasn't guaranteed. It no longer stood as an untouchable giant in Christian broadcasting. It stood as a fragile institution teetering on the edge. For viewers, the wound cut deep. Some walked away from Christian television altogether. Others held on cautiously, but the innocence was gone. They could no longer tune in without hearing the nagging voice of doubt. They no longer gave without wondering where their money was going. That suspicion was the most lasting damage of all. The truth is, once trust is broken in matters of faith, it rarely comes back. People may forgive, but they don't forget. For Daystar, the uncertainty wasn't just about ratings or finances. It was about whether people could ever believe again. And for Joanie Lamb, once the face of hope and faith for millions, the hardest reality may be this. It wasn't the scandals themselves that destroyed her image. It was the refusal to confront them with honesty. And because of that, trust has been shattered, and the future, for her, for Daystar, and for those who once believed, remains painfully uncertain.